Thanks, Peter. Thanks to the Aspen Institute, and thank you all for joining us for this panel. This morning, some of you were at our panel when we talked about Shadi Hamid's book, Islamic Exceptionalism, how the struggle over Islam is shaping the world. Today, we're going to dive deeper into the issue of ISIS and whether we're beating the Islamic group. We have a really great panel today. Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy Rick Stengel, who's doing so much on the battle to combat the ideology of ISIS. Shadi is going to talk about some of the issues surrounding Islam and that he's in his book. And I really encourage you, if you haven't read it and you really want to understand ISIS, this is such a good way to look at the origins of political Islam and how ISIS fits into that. And we have Jessica Stern of Boston University. So we're going to start off, I'm going to have a conversation with the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And obviously, with everything going on in the news right now, it's going to be a very lively discussion. In recent months, we've heard about a lot of successes about ISIS on the battlefield. Iraqi forces and Syrian Arab Kurds, with the help of the US-led coalition, have been able to gain territory from ISIS. And a new government in Libya, partnering with the US and its allies, has ISIS on the run there. Many of the group's leaders have been killed, and ISIS is losing a lot of assets and resources. Yet the battlefield and its ideology has spread from Iraq and Syria to Paris, Brussels, Istanbul, in attacks directed or inspired by ISIS. Here in the United States, in San Bernardino, and most recently in Orlando, America faced the largest terror attack on US soil since 9/11, the worst shooting in our history. Not directed by ISIS, but again, inspired. So what is ISIS fighting for? What are they offering their recruits that traditional societies are not? And how does the US fight an enemy that is no longer a group, but an idea? That's just to set our conversation off. Shadi, I want to start with you and talk a little bit about the lightning speed of ISIS and how it captured all this territory. You started with what, 1,000 fighters, able to quickly gain territory in Iraq and Syria, overpowering thousands of Iraqi forces and Syrian opposition, Syrian regime fighters. They're good fighters, I think everyone agrees, but how did such a small number quickly gain such territory? It feels like it happened in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, so first of all, I think if we go back a few years, 2009, 2010, the predecessor organization to ISIS seemed to be roundly defeated. So just a reminder that just in the span of a few years, everything can change. If we were talking 6, 7 years ago, no one would have, I don't know of anyone who was able to or was willing to predict that there would be something else that would be worse, more powerful, more effective. So,
And Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. And that goes to show that this is a very fluid context. In terms of how they were able to gain territory quite quickly, Mosul was a very interesting case to look at. This is the second largest city in Iraq, and ISIS goes in with about 1,000 fighters and is able to overwhelm Iraqi security forces of around 30,000. So it raises the question, how is that possible? And this is where I think ideology and motivation is very important. That here you have 1,000 fighters who have a cause that they're willing to die for. And they also happen to be good fighters, and that is a powerful combination. On the other hand, if you look at Iraqi forces, these were people who didn't necessarily have a cause to die for. They maybe weren't very inspired or motivated. And we're also talking about an Iraqi state that is very divided along sectarian lines and that has undermined the effectiveness of the Iraqi army, although they are getting better over time, thankfully. So I think that's where we have to factor in the role of religion and motivation when it comes to people who are willing to die for a cause. That gives them a kind of built-in advantage on the battlefield.
Could I just make...
Yeah, please. I think we're just going to keep this kind of free-flowing. So I have a bunch of questions for you guys, but I want you to feel free to chime in.
I just wanted to add, I think it's really important to remember that Saddam's military and intelligence personnel who had been fired when we went to war in Iraq made up part of Baghdadi's forces. And that, I think helps to explain why they were so successful.
Rick, I want to talk about the recruitment that was able to help ISIS ranks swell, and how deft ISIS was in using propaganda to spread its ideology. I mean, as a media professional, you know, while you saw their barbarism, I mean, it was pretty impressive, the propaganda arm, in terms of their use of technology, their use of social media, their use of videos, to gain so many recruiters and spread the idea that their jihad was winning.
Thanks, Elise, for that. Hi, everybody. I think there's been a lot of misconceptions about that. And the first misconception is that somehow their propaganda, their social media, is so diabolically clever that they are taking otherwise nice young Muslim boys and girls out of their homes and getting them to fight in Iraq and Syria. What they are doing is capitalizing on a gigantic market of grievance in the Muslim world, much of it justified, rather than creating a market for their content. It's not that their content is so good.
It wasn't a market, but certainly they were using, and when you think of a group like ISIS, you think, oh, these guys are savages. They're not necessarily savages.
No, but
they're 21st
the other
century.
thing is, it's a little bit like, Dr. Johnson's line about a dog walking on its hind legs. It may not do it well, but it's kind of amazing that it does it at all. We thought that Al-Qaeda was so sophisticated. We created within the State Department a whole entity to combat Al-Qaeda online, CSCC, the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, because they were so diabolically clever. And ISIL is a step forward, but it isn't Game of Thrones. And I think one of the things that it's been aided and abetted by the media that shows their content over and over. So for example, if you look at the beheading videos from 2014, you cannot go back and see them, but even if you look at the Steven Sotloff video or the Foley video, it only had 200 views on YouTube. Many, many more millions of people saw it on CNN than saw it on YouTube. So media has played an unhelpful role in this. So the other thing that people don't realize, do folks know, so if you look at all the content that ISIL does, anybody want to guess what language most of it is in? So Arabic, about 85%. Second language, anyone want to guess? Russian. Third language, French. Fourth language, English. By the way, all the people who cover this, including all of the smart people at CNN, very few of them speak Arabic. Very few of them see the content that they're doing. ISIL's audience in social media is not us. It's not you all. It's not America. It's Arabic-speaking young people in the Middle East. And so we have conflated what they're doing with some idea that they're trying to attack us, and it's not. We're the third or fourth least language in terms of the content they produce.
Well, certainly it's true that I think that ISIS did not start going after and targeting and inspiring its followers to make attacks on the U.S. until the U.S. started its anti-ISIS coalition.
Well, and the other premise of your question that's wrong is how many people they've recruited. From the very beginning, if you look at the entire number of foreign fighters who have gone to fight in Iraq and Syria, from the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, that's 40,000 people. What is that, David? About the circulation of the New Republic, right? Is that a big audience? So how successful have they been if out of 1.6 billion people, they've attracted 40,000 people?
But I think that this is one of the lessons of ISIS, is that you don't actually need to have widespread popular support to be incredibly effective. And I'm glad that we should always offer this disclaimer when we talk about ISIS. The overwhelming majority of Muslims oppose ISIS. And it's unfortunate that we have to keep on saying that. But speaking as an American Muslim, I think it's important to emphasize that. That said, 40,000 people can do a lot of damage in a region that has weak states, that has weak armies. And that's why they've been able to do a lot more than their numbers would suggest. And I think, unfortunately, it's one of the lessons of the Arab Spring. People power doesn't actually necessarily depend on people. It depends on force and brutality. And that's not just the case for ISIS, but also the brutal authoritarian regimes that still populate much of the Middle East. Some of them are our close allies, another issue. But force works. And when you're protesting in a square and your government is trying to shoot you down, Twitter's not going to be very effective, right?
So Jessica, let's talk about what ISIS is providing their fighters, their recruits, that their own traditional societies failed to do. Particularly, you have so many Western Muslims going over to be foreign fighters. How much of this is a search for their own identity and purpose?
Well, I think we need to distinguish between the fighters who join from the surrounding region and those who join from the West. ISIS provides all kinds of benefits. To locals, we often, fighters who get out are saying, you know, I joined ISIS because they paid more. And by the way, they also provide wives, and they provide sex slaves, and in terms of how they recruit in the West, I think part of it is that they're providing excitement and identity to people who feel disenfranchised or lost. And that's particularly true in Europe, where we have enclaves of Muslim migrants who have been treated really, really badly. In the United States, ISIS has been remarkably unsuccessful, at least so far. And part of that is that American Muslims are happier with the direction of the country than other religious groups, according to recent polls. America is not a good place for them to recruit. Nonetheless, there are certain pockets where they have been successful. One of them is among the Somali refugee community. And we have a big study of Somali refugees out of Children's Hospital in Boston, looking at Somali refugees in Portland, Maine, in Toronto, in different parts of North America. And we find that what makes them vulnerable is prejudice, perceived prejudice, and what makes them less vulnerable is attachment to the heritage community as well as to the United States and Canada. So ISIS's campaign to make Muslims feel unsafe in the West, that's a very important part of its campaign. If you look at it, the last version of Dabik, they are threatening imams directly, by name.
Shadi, talk to me a little bit more about this, about the search for identity and purpose. How much of it is about religion, and how much of it is about something more? I mean, we talk about ISIS as very much a counterterrorism campaign, but are we falling into a trap a little bit by dismissing this as just a perversion of Islam and not seeing the roots of where this is coming from?
So, I mean, first of all, I think even the way, so we frame things as something is either religious or political, or religious, political, and economic. And just based on my own field research in the region, living in the Middle East, I mean, if you actually talk to, and it's Islamist activists of various stripes, more mainstream political actors, but even ordinary conservative Muslims who take their religion seriously, what you'll find is they don't really separate between religious and political necessarily the way that we do, where in the US, religion is a category that you put to the side, and it's almost like a box. Is this religious or not? And what I found in my own interviews is that these concepts in real life, as it's actually lived, are endlessly intertwined. That's the first thing I would say. I think that this leads me to the other thing, that those of us from a kind of secular background, from the northeastern liberal elites or Aspen or whatever, is that we have trouble taking religious motivations seriously. And I noticed this with President Obama, where he says things like, oh, they're just a bunch of thugs or fanatics, which I think is a very dismissive way of talking about ISIS, which doesn't take them seriously enough. Because if they're thugs and fanatics, should we really be too worried about a bunch of thugs? And I think that thugs also diminishes the power of ideas and the power of religion as a motivator. That's not to say that ISIS has tapped into the true tradition of Islam. No, as I said before, most Muslims think that they have distorted and perverted Islam, but they think that they're right. And who are we to doubt that they believe the things that they say? Not all of them, but a lot of them do. So, and the other thing too is when we talk about ISIS as having, and Obama said this, I don't mean to be too mean to Obama, but when he says things like ISIS has no place in the 21st century, I actually think it's the opposite. For me, at least, ISIS would be inconceivable in any century but the 21st. They are a modern product, a modern phenomenon.
Can I piggyback on that? I mean, I do think the issue of identity is at the core of their recruitment and the core of their appeal. One of the things that people also don't realize about the content that they create is that about 80% of it is positive. We look at the beheading videos, we look at violence, about 80% of it is like, come to the caliphate, and how wonderful it is, and how beautiful it is. That's an inspirational, altruistic appeal, which appeals to both people who are religious and not religious. That is part of their appeal, another thing that we don't understand. And because so many young Muslims around the world feel insecure about their religion and their devotion. I mean, one of the brilliant aspects of Shadi's book is that it, in a way that for people in the West don't understand, it shows how Islam spans both the political and the personal in a way that we don't do. We have a secular society where we have church and state separate. That is something that's alien to the idea of Islam. So part of their appeal is this altruistic appeal. But at the same time, I mean, to go back to the beginning, I mean, and just to kind of reassure people here, the battle against them on both the military battlefield and the information battlefield is being won. I mean, you referred to it in the beginning. I'm not on the military battlefield, but we've taken back almost half of their territory in Iraq. We took Fallujah recently. Mosul will be taken sometime this year. They will virtually cease to exist on the military battlefield within a year. They exist on the information battlefield, and they're a kind of virtual caliphate there, which I agree with you, that's the only reason they could live in the 21st century. But if you just look at the numbers that I've been looking at in the last few days, the amount of content that they're creating online is down by 50%. The average number of followers of any ISIL account is down by 80%. They are losing on the information battlefield as well. And we also now look, from when I first started getting in this area, there's now 6 times as much anti-ISIL content on the web and social media as there is pro-ISIL content. So we're drowning out their message.
Shadi, would you agree that they're, in terms of the information war, that they're losing it?
Yeah, I think that Rick is right on this, that there's also been a lot of efforts on the part of Twitter and Facebook to really crack down on accounts, and it's more thought out, it's more systematic in terms of how we deal with their presence on social media. That's certainly true, and I think this is a very important point. I'm glad that Rick emphasized it, is that they're not just going around blowing things up. It's not just a negative message. ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda to some extent, has an unusually pronounced interest in governance. They are state builders. That's been a big part of their project in Iraq and Syria. So where with Al-Qaeda, they were very good at blowing things up, but they didn't really offer something in the place of what they were blowing up. And this, to me, is why ISIS is such a it's a scarier foe than Al-Qaeda ever was, because of that additional vision of state building that they have. And this is also why I think that even if we defeat ISIS tomorrow morning or a year or whatever, and I think we will eventually, I worry that it's too late to undo the damage, because the legacy of ISIS will be with us for decades to come, for the rest of our lives, in the sense that any time there's an ungoverned space in the Middle East or beyond, you're going to have that little extremist group that thinks to itself, ISIS has set the standard for extremist groups. We're not just going to blow things up. We're going to try to capture territory and hold territory and establish our own little mini caliphate or mini emirate. So in that sense, once ideas are introduced, you can't take that idea of state building and governance outside and go back to the mid-2000s. And that for me is why I'm not very optimistic. So we'll defeat them, but we won't defeat the idea of holding and capturing territory.
Yeah,
I would say to that, I would be really short. The consolation, though, of that is we're actually good at fighting states. we're not good at fighting non-state actors. So the actual physical so-called caliphate will go away. I like it when they aspire to hold physical territory because we know how to do that. The challenge is the idea of the virtual caliphate, which is something which is harder to defeat, and what they have become in that realm is a kind of umbrella brand for grievance.
Right.
Whatever your problem is, you can say, I'm doing it in the name of ISIS.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit in a bit about the kind of long-term efforts to combat violent extremism. Jessica, some of the more spectacular attacks that we saw lately seem to be the work of larger cells, but as Rick was saying, this phenomenon has grown of the lone wolf. And we saw this in Orlando, San Bernardino, but also some of these beheadings in Canada and killings in London and England and beyond. Talk a little bit about this phenomenon. Like, not all these people were necessarily kind of devout Muslims. Some were even Muslim converts, kids from good schools. What inspires a good kid from a good family, for instance, to either want to travel to Iraq and Syria to fight jihad or to want to do something, in their own home territory?
We know a lot more about how groups form, what are the risk factors for groups to form. For example, failed states. There's very little debate in the academic community about whether failed states are a risk factor. High male to female ratios, youth bulges, those are risk factors at the level of a state. At the level of individuals, we haven't made that much progress. However, we have made progress when it comes to lone wolves. And for example, in comparing lone wolves on the very far right, individuals with the groups, we know that about 40% have documented mental illness. Many more of them may be mentally ill or have personality disorders, but 40% have documented mental illness prior to the attack.
Or are just kind of troubled.
Right. Also, one thing I can tell you is that they almost invariably have a mix of motives. For example, they might be seeking revenge against homosexuals, or in the case of the Washington sniper, while he had an ideology, he also had it in for his ex-wife. That would be typical of lone wolves, that they have this mix. The good thing, I can tell you, to make you feel a little better, is that at least 60% of the time, they not only, 80% of the time they talk about their ideology and vague plans. 60% of the time, according to a study done by a colleague of mine, John Horgan and Paul Gill, this is across the board, not the far right, this is every ideology. They actually tell someone, I am going to carry out a terrorist attack. So what this means is we can play a role. Ordinary citizens can play a role in this fight.
How do we do that? How do we reach these would-be lone wolves that aren't necessarily even tied to any Islamic movement, but are alienated and troubled, and ISIS is preying upon them?
Well, first of all, I should point out that according to George Washington University Program on Extremism, of the 91 cases that have been brought into U.S. courts, 36% of those are converts. And many of these converts are converts to ISIS ideology. I actually talked to an imam. He's at Duke. He's known as the Blue Devil Imam, who does counter radicalization with some of the youth. And he says they actually know nothing about Islam. As soon as he tells them, well, we begin by reading the Quran, they're very quickly bored. In fact, knowledge about Islam is a bulwark against kids getting recruited. What I meant to say about the role that we can play, one of the roles is not necessarily the people in this room, but family members often do know. And it's very, very hard if you have someone in your family you think is going to carry out an attack of violence to tell the authorities. But they need to.
Does ISIS care whether these people don't even really adhere to Islam? I mean, are they just means to an end, or does everything have to be in the furtherance of their ideology?
So I think one thing to remember here is that being religiously observant or knowing a lot about Islam is not a precondition to thinking that you're religious or wanting to be more religious. What you find with some of these recruits is it's aspirational, and by joining ISIS, they feel they can kind of cleanse their past of the sins they had committed. So, you know, one hypothesis with the Orlando shooter is people say, well, would ISIS accept someone who might have been gay or had, you know, been tortured about his sexuality? I don't actually see that as being a very big jump for ISIS, in the sense that they might actually like it that he was trying to redeem himself through violence and undo his past of quote unquote sin. And we have a lot of other examples that before terrorist attacks, you know, would-be terrorists are going to strip clubs, or they're not known to be particularly religious. So I think that you can be a not very good Muslim, but you still feel that ISIS can bring you closer to what you want to aspire to religiously.
Rick, let's talk about some of the efforts that you and the State Department are working on to counter violent extremism and prevention, because even if you said earlier, even if you defeat ISIS now, there'll be reiterations for as long as we're going to be around. There'll be the next ISIS around the corner.
So the government phrase, the acronym, we love acronyms in government. I spent my first 6 months trying to remember them all, is CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. And having now been in the CVE business for a couple of years, I'm much more humble about what you can do to counter violent extremism. Even that expression, counter violent extremism, is a bit of a misnomer, and particularly when it comes to the messaging space. There's nothing that Rick Stengel, Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, can say to a young man in Belgium or France or wherever to say, don't go and fight for ISIS in Iraq and Syria. They use our overt government-branded messaging as a recruitment tool. So there's very little that we can do in that respect. Much of what we do is in the realm of preventing violent extremism, to go from the kind of core to the edges. So that the entity in the State Department is something called the Global Engagement Center, which exists to counter violent extremist messaging. But it's the central insight in how we're doing it now, and we got a new presidential executive order last year. Its new mission is not to do our own messaging, but how do we help and optimize and give greater resonance to the messaging of mainstream Muslim groups and individuals all around the world. Because ultimately, in that information battlefield, it's their voices that are way more important than our voices. In that central idea that it's not about what we do, but about helping others, we have all kinds of programs from, for example, last week I was in Palo Alto for the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, which is a fantastic signature event
great program
of President Obama. It brings 700 young entrepreneurs from all around the world, 150 from the Muslim world, 150 from Africa, who are doing social entrepreneurship, many of which are CVE, although we don't call it CVE. So we do that with some things like the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. We do hackathons, we do tech camps, we do exchanges, leadership exchanges where we bring young Muslim women and men from the Middle East over to the US. We have a fantastic program for young Muslim women from the Middle East coming to study STEM subjects here. All of these are on this CVE continuum. That's on the softer realm, but it's also on the longer term realm. And those are really productive things that we do. It doesn't have an instant effect, but it has a long-term effect.
Yeah, talk about the long-term effects.
Well, so just one thing to add, and then on the long-term issues. So radicalization is inelegant, and we've talked about how there are so many different motivations, and it's complex, and these motivations are intertwined. So what that means in practice is that there is always going to be some terrorism, because we're never going to be able to account for all motivations or all grievances. And I think we have to be realistic about this, that we're going to live Sorry.
Can ISIS even itself be contained? I mean, you can't contain Islamic extremism, obviously, but
Yeah, well, so on this point, and actually, I should mention that Jessica's work on how to model radicalization is really interesting. I remember you had a phrase, maybe it was in Terror in the Name of God, or maybe an article where you compared radicalization to love. That it's very personal, it's very idiosyncratic. Is that, or well?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Well,
That could be misinterpreted.
yeah, but in the sense that you can't model it. You can't like X, Y, Z, this is how radicalization happens. But one thing that I noticed, and this gets to the point of how we approach this long term. So I interviewed the friends and family of Tunisian foreign fighters in Tunisia last year. And so talking to a father whose son had fought and died for ISIS. Well, first of all, it's a weird thing, because how do you talk to a father who lost his son to ISIS? It's a difficult conversation. But one thing that struck me with Tunisian foreign fighters is that their relatives all said that one of the initial sparks was the atrocities they saw in Syria from the Assad regime. They saw their fellow Muslims being killed in large numbers, and that sense of grievance was part of the motivation. Then you mix that with other things and you have a perfect storm, right? So I think that we talk a lot about the very narrow aspects of how do we do CVE and counterterrorism programming, and that's a very narrow way of looking at fighting ISIS. And that's where I think the long-term vision of our engagement in the Middle East, it's amazing to me that when we talk about ISIS, we don't talk about the broader issues, the broader vision. And I live in DC, and the one word I almost never hear anymore is, it's a bad word, the D word, democracy. We don't like talking about promoting democracy abroad. And now we use kind of inclusive governance, pluralism, because these ideas have been tainted. But I would argue that as much as I didn't like the Bush administration, they got a lot of things wrong, including the Iraq War, of course, that the one thing they did get right was this idea that animated the freedom agenda, that the only way to really fight extremism in the long run is to address some of the root causes, and that you have to give people democratic opportunity, political opportunity, and if people don't have a way to express their grievances, then they're more likely to resort to violence of various kinds. And the fact that we're not having a national conversation about promoting democracy abroad, or for God's sake, doing something to stop the killing of more than 400,000 Syrians. Let's not forget, ISIS wouldn't be what it is today without the brutality of the Assad regime. In some ways, they're two sides of the same coin. So we cannot defeat ISIS unless we address the Assad problem.
I'm going to let you respond, Rick, but just quickly, Jessica, so you've made progress against ISIS on the battlefield, but to Shadi's point, is there enough kind of post-ISIS planning in the Middle East, and how do you avoid falling into a trap where if there's not a clear alternative, we've kind of gotten out of the business of nation building?
Yeah, I think ISIS is a symptom of civil war, of state failure. We see it spreading into regions of poor governance. Democracy, in the long term, I agree with you, Shadi, but in the very long term, we know that the transition from autocratic rule to democracy is actually a very fraught and dangerous period. That's where we do see more internal war and more terrorism. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why we see more of a focus on state failure.
Rick?
I do agree that certainly long term, talking about democracy and exemplifying democracy are incredibly important. And by the way, we do that all of the time. Everywhere we go in the Middle East, we talk about freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, better governance. But at the same time, in the domestic space, when you have in a presidential campaign people talking about a religious test for immigration, what that does is it confirms the central premise of ISIL's recruitment argument, which is that the West is trying to get rid of Islam. And so that makes what we do abroad, when we talk about all these values, and we do talk about all of these values all of the time, it makes it questionable. It makes them call us hypocrites. And that doesn't do a great job when it comes to what we're trying to do. And yes, I think perhaps the Bush administration went too far in this kind of idea of evolving the Middle East into a bastion of democracy. And I would say, even based on your book, Islamic Exceptionalism, Islamic countries will not and never will have, and for many good reasons, the same idea of democracy as we have and probably shouldn't have. But we often undermine those goals with what we're doing in our own domestic political space.
All right, I'm going to open it up to questions. If you have a question, please signal to me. We're going to ask you to keep your questions short. Don't make a very long comment. I want to ask short, direct questions so we can get as many in as possible. We're going to go to the gentleman over there and then to this gentleman over here. Thanks. Just right here in the white.
Yeah, I've observed that Muslim leaders and imams, I don't see them speaking up against radical Islam. And I've talked to some Muslims about it, and they'll say that the media, the press, doesn't allow them to speak up. So my question is, how do you get the Muslim leaders, the imams, particularly in the mosques, to talk about denounce radical Islam, and should we go into the mosque to see what they're saying and try to encourage them to speak up against it, denounce it?
Shadi, why don't you take that?
So, look, all we do is condemn. I mean, I'm tired of condemning all the time, and even the expectation that as an American Muslim, people are like, I have to, again, offer disclaimers, otherwise people might be like, wait, what does he really think? And I shouldn't, as an individual American citizen, just by virtue of being Muslim, feel a responsibility to condemn every time there's a terrorist attack. If I want to, great, but I don't think that should be the expectation. I'll also say Muslim leaders in America and organizations, they condemn nonstop. They're overboard in their condemnations. But, people don't pay attention to that because it's not interesting. It's not a story. Fox News does not cover American Muslim condemnations of terrorism. So, and the last thing we want to do is go into mosques and do surveillance. I think we're already sometimes doing too much of that and alienating local Muslim communities with aggressive law enforcement approaches. And let's just also remember that what ISIS, and a lot of us have touched on this, what ISIS wants to do is create divisions in the West. They want Muslims to feel like they won't be fully American or fully French or fully British. So if we're doing things in our country that is contributing to anti-Muslim bigotry, and let's be honest, there is a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry in the US. It's a scary time. I have never felt the way I felt in this country, in my country. It's not even comparable to after 9/11. This is worse. This is worse. I mean, everyone talks about us as if we're an object.
And a monolithic entity,
yeah,
too.
so everyone's going on like on the main television stations, the Muslims this, the Muslims that, and they have Donald Trump going on endlessly about the Muslim threat, and then people are debating Donald Trump's proposals as if they're legitimate. Oh, is it constitutional to have a ban on Muslim immigration to the U.S., a religious test? But once you start discussing these things in the mainstream media in this very serious way, you're mainstreaming anti-Muslim bigotry.
Giving it
so we have to
currency.
be careful about that, I think.
Jessica?
I just want to add that there are thousands of imams who have gone, and some argue that ISIS is not Muslim. Some argue with them, saying you're being takfiri. Also, you're saying this person is not a Muslim. There's so many different arguments. If you want to see some of them, King Abdullah has created a venue for imams to denounce ISIS. I think the problem is that they're boring. The argument against ISIS is not exciting, and it's not getting to the 19-year-olds who want to convert to ISIS Islam. So that's...
Yeah, and it's very interesting, actually. The State Department is working with a lot of Muslims around the world, as Rick was saying, and in fact, to give a message aimed at younger people. And in fact, I think a lot of imams have actually been threatened for speaking out. So thank you for your question. Okay, I'm gonna let's go right here to the gentleman right here, and then we'll go back over there, and then we'll move to this side.
So you talked at the beginning a little bit about the use of YouTube and Twitter and social media recruitment, but could you talk a little bit about in-theater direct recruitment? Because my suspicion is the vast number of 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds in theater don't have iPhones with Twitter and aren't sitting with MacBook Airs sort of surfing the net, that they're living in a relative theater of poverty, and that most of the recruitment ends up being sort of one-to-one or amongst groups and person-to-person. Could you shed some light on that?
Yes, you shed a lot of light on it on yourself. So I'll first talk about the macro messaging on those platforms. I don't think the tech companies get enough credit for what they're doing. Twitter announced a few months ago that they've taken down more than 200,000 ISIL-related handles. They've taken down way more than that. YouTube takes down videos literally sometimes within seconds, often just a few minutes, literally with 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 views. Facebook has an entire team working 24/7 to take down noxious content that violates their terms of service and the content of people that like that content. So I think the tech companies, they sometimes don't want as much credit as they deserve, but they're really zealous in this.
Okay.
So your second part of the question, though, is, and this touches on what we were talking about before, the lone wolf meme is a bit of a misnomer. I'd argue there's no such thing as a lone wolf, which was the premise of your question. Basically, there's no spontaneous conversion to violent extremism from watching videos. Every example we will ever see about people who are touched by many, many people. Why are there so many pairs of brothers and cousins from the same family that are involved? Because it's about a personal touch. It's much more of an epidemiological model of the transfer of disease, of repeated exposure to that noxious content and recruitment, and that happens person to person rather than over social media.
I think we've also kind of overused the term lone wolf. I mean, I think what we really mean when we say lone wolf is not part of an ISIS cell or someone or a group of people that kind of indigenously get radicalized online or through their mosque and then decide to take it in the name maybe of an extremist group. Do we have any questions on this side of the room? No. Okay, let's go.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so there you go. Sorry, sir.
You mentioned that to contain ISIS, we have to contain first the Assad regime. But somehow, to contain Assad regime, you have to contain the Putin's strategy and policy broadly in Eastern Europe and there as well. So, my question is, don't you think that the ISIS phenomenon is growing and developing is because it has become the part of the games of other geopolitical players? And as you see, even the latest attack in Istanbul, there were people from former Soviet Union, and it's kind of growing in an unpredictable way. Thank you.
It's an interesting phenomenon that a lot of ISIS fighters are coming from Russia, Dagestan, Chechnya, Uzbekistan. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't have the answer to that. I don't really focus on the Russia this form. Maybe Jessica will have some ideas, but I will say this on the issue of the Assad regime and Russia and so on, is that we're having this conversation at a time, and I've noticed this is a theme that comes up in this Aspen Ideas Festival. Almost every conversation I've had here, there's a lack of confidence in American leadership. We don't know what our role is in the world anymore. So it is true that Russia has won, in a way, in Syria, and that they've made themselves indispensable. And here we are as Americans reacting to Russian initiatives in Syria. And as long as we do that, I think that there's going to be this vacuum of leadership, and the Russians and others, people who we don't like or play a counterproductive role, are going to fill that vacuum of leadership. So it gets to these very basic questions about who we are as a nation and what our role in the world is. And I'll also say that nation building has become a bad word or bad two words. But I think we have to reopen the discussion in the US about nation building, because you can't actually defeat ISIS if there isn't a post-war plan the day after. And I was just speaking recently to a group of US military officers, and I was like, from what I understand, there isn't a lot of post-war vision, post-war planning. And they're like, yeah, we're gonna make the same mistake again. What do we do in Mosul after it's liberated from ISIS? And part of the reason we don't have a plan is because that requires committing billions of dollars and playing a very intense leadership role. And is there stomach in the US for doing that? I would hope that there either is or will be in the future, but that will be the test for the new administration. Are we willing to lead in Syria, Iraq, and actually commit more resources?
Well, I would disagree with some of the premise of your answer, which is that, and by the way, the question, they're recruiting in those places. Russian is the second biggest language because there's so much grievance there and there's opportunity for people. But in terms of what we're doing in a post-ISIL world, and we talk about a post-ISIL world, there's a 66-nation coalition that my boss, Secretary Kerry, created, the Anti-ISIL Coalition. And only a handful of those countries are fighting on the military battlefield. But there's roles for all of the others in terms of stabilization. Italy has spent millions and millions of dollars training police officers in cities like Fallujah, and they have a plan to do that in Mosul. There is a plan because people do realize that having a vacuum after ISIL is taken off of the physical battlefield would cause all kinds of repercussions that we've seen before. So having been in these meetings, and we have a meeting of the coalition later this month, all of those things are being taken into account. And frankly, the US role is an indispensable role. And certainly, even though I think there's ambivalence about that in the domestic space, there's no ambivalence about that in the international space. Everybody wants the US to be involved. And part of it is that we are often spread thin because we are indispensable to the solutions in all of these places, and we can't be everywhere.
Jessica.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that the jihadis that we think were involved in the bombing in Turkey, those are enemies of Putin. This has nothing to do with, Putin was taking a risk by getting involved, and these individuals, these jihadi groups in Chechnya and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they've been active for a long time. I can tell you that in the madrasa that created the Taliban in Pakistan, there was something called Russia House, because these groups have wanted to get active in the international jihadi movement for quite some time.
Sir.
Shadid, everyone has to follow you on Twitter. I'm a much brighter person because you're on this earth, and thank you for what you're doing. While we were talking, the White House released that 116 people have been killed, innocent people have been killed through drone attacks. For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. There's been 23,000 missiles dropped on ISIS. We started with 40,000 ISIS militants. We're still at 40,000 ISIS militants almost 2 years later. How much of an effect is our attacks on innocent people creating and breeding more terrorism?
I'm not going to deal with the last part of your question, but the number of ISIL foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria is the lowest time it has been since 2014. The number of foreign fighters going there each month, DoD estimates as 200, where in 2014 it was over 2,000. So they are at their lowest ebb that they have ever been, and that they are shrinking. That was part of your question.
So I think we have to speak frankly about our role as Americans in the Middle East, and not just in recent years, but for decades. I think we have a very tragic history in the Middle East. We pretty much have supported brutal authoritarian regimes pretty consistently. We've been there's a lot of violence. We've been involved in that, so on and so forth. A lot of you will know that history. On drone attacks, there's an interesting debate about drones and pros and cons. I am personally more on the anti. There has to be some of that, but I feel like we aren't as targeted as we should be, and we've come to rely on drone strikes as this kind of catch-all solution in any number of different countries. And we can see examples of blowback and the kind of grievance that builds in places like Yemen, in parts of Pakistan, and so on. And I think that drone attacks are an easy answer because, again, it's a way to say, hey, we don't want to be too much more involved in the Middle East. Let's do this hands-off approach of drones instead of thinking, I think, more systematically about how we can really help these countries rebuild and actually having a more hopeful vision for the region. So I think we have to have we have been having the conversation about drone attacks. I don't know how mainstream it is. Perhaps it should be more mainstream. But yes, there are major issues that have to be addressed with drone attacks, and they have increased under Obama. And that is part of a legacy that the next administration will have to contend with.
And I don't disagree with anything that Shadi said. And our history in the Middle East is a difficult and challenging one, and not always a story of successes. But to talk about drones, and the President Obama has been the largest user of drones. It's a reaction to the environment that he encountered when he ran for president. We were coming out of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. Would you prefer to have American troops on the ground in those places where there are drone attacks? Would anybody here? I mean,
No, I think what Shadi's saying though is even if the justification is there, that the end result is
mixed.
The end result is not only mixed, but is inspiring some of this, American vitriol for America, regardless of the justification of the.
Right, but people, I think, and I would throw it back on the audience. I mean, people have to make decisions about where would you like American troops to be and not to be. The president had basically said there's very, very few situations that would ever justify American boots on the ground. That was the political situation that he faced in 2008 in the aftermath of the Iraq War.
But it doesn't have to be
Right. I don't want to get this into I don't want to get into a debate on drones. There's actually some news from the president on drones. I encourage you to check it out on the internet, sir.
Yes. Is there any validity to the reports that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states have in the past and continue to provide financial support to ISIS? And if there is any validity to it, is anything that you folks are aware of being done to stop it?
Rick.
I was hoping someone else would jump in. There have been many, many reports, and as you know, there was that redacted section of the report about potential Saudi contributions. It's a very gray area in the sense that are there Saudi nonprofits that acted as conduit to funds for people who committed terrorist acts? It's a very difficult and tenuous trail. What we as government officials look at is there support from the Saudi regime for terrorists or for ISIL, and that's not something that we see. It's a difficult and complex area, and I think it's the sort of thing that will eventually be released. People will be able to read that and make judgments on their own. And as you've seen, many of our elected leaders have given their opinions about it and said that actually there's much less there than meets the eye, and some people have said, no, this seems to involve the Saudi regime, but it's absolutely not a completely clear-cut thing. And I would say, just to go forward, Saudi Arabia now has this very dynamic young leader, Mohammed bin Salman, who's 30 years old, who is looking for a Saudi Arabia that could be transformed and in a way that is closer to what our values are and democratic values. And to me, I think we need to be looking forward.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes. Jessica's going to respond very quickly. If you have a question, raise your hand. We're going to take a quick lightning round. Jessica.
I think the evidence that Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf states are supporting ISIS, I think there is no evidence of that. And the Treasury Intelligence Unit has made that clear. That doesn't mean that the Saudi individuals haven't been involved in the past. But to answer your specific question, the answer is no.
Okay, everybody, no, I understand, sir. I just want to see who else has questions, and after this, sir, we're going to take just a couple more. Sir.
One area that I think is overlooked here is the way Islam is taught in the madrasas, the way it's taught in terms of promoting an environment for radicalization, the Wahhabism, the Salafism. The tendency to teach in that way predisposes a lot of people to, if not supporting ISIS, if not supporting the destruction of a Christian community or a Yazidi community, it certainly promotes silence in response to that. And so what role within Islam, I think, is the great challenge to redirect the way Islam is taught from a very early age, which predisposes people to radicalism.
There is this perception that in the madrasas, that's where a lot of Muslims are learning to be extremists. Do you agree with that? And then you speak to this larger issue of how Islam should be taught.
Look,
in the madrasa.
I agree that it's a problem, so I can't really argue that with that. It's bad, it's a problem. But I think that to say that it's primarily, so if we're talking about like French foreign fighters or Tunisian foreign fighters, I mean, those aren't people who have gone through the madrasa system. So it's one part of a complicated picture. What I would say on that is it's hard to address, and there have been U.S. efforts to address some of that by encouraging our allies to clamp down on some of that teaching. But I think that one problem is that one response we've had is, hey, let's find some moderate clerics to promote a nice fluffy version of Islam to counter the version that's been taught at the madrasas. That might be nice and good, maybe, but the problem with that is the people who are predisposed to radicalization are never going to listen to a nice fluffy cleric who speaks fluent English and is being flown in from the US by the State Department. They're going to listen to a tough, oppositional, anti-establishment firebrand preacher because they're looking for meaning in their politics. They're not looking for a nice, peaceful, pluralistic Islam. They're looking for an uncompromising Islam. So some of it has to do with what people are looking for, and they're already predisposed, and they find things that confirm their predisposition.
I think we can take one more question. If you have a question, raise your hand. Okay, right over here.
Does it make any difference?
Wait for the microphone, please.
He's got a booming voice, though.
It won't be recorded if you don't.
We want to record you.
Thank you. This is a question about terminology. Does it make any difference from a practical standpoint to anybody but U.S. politicians whether extremism is referred to as radical Islam or not?
Shadi.
Okay, so I have a rule that I do not use that phrase radical Islam. I feel that maybe it wouldn't have been a big deal 6 years ago, but because Trump has become obsessed with this phrase, I think he's now invested it with new meaning, and it's become effectively a stand-in for anti-Muslim bigotry. And I think it's also conducive to that because if you put radical and Islam next to each other, then it's going to raise the question, is there something inherently radical about Islam? Why do we have this particular combination of words? I think we have more precise alternatives, so there's no need.
What kind of alternatives? Because I mean, I agree with you that it's become this kind of catchphrase that seems to brand all Islam, but what about the idea when you talk to some people that they say, well, this is the way of saying it's not all Muslims or not all of Islam, but just this kind of radical small group of extremists.
Okay, but so the alternatives that I have in mind are There's a pretty long list: radical Islamism, radical jihadism, Salafi jihadism, Islamic extremism, Muslim extremism. If you really want to, you could do radical Islamic terrorism. I mean, there's like an endless combination and arrangement of words, and it's weird to me that we're having a national debate now, thanks to Mr. Trump, about how, so instead of how do we actually fight terrorism and have a vision for engaging with the Middle East, we're getting into this endless partisan debate about what particular combination of words to put next to each other. And I think that's problematic, and that's not where the focus should be. And I think it also matters how Muslims feel about the words that are used to describe their religion. So if a bunch of Muslims, including me, and this is pretty much across the board with pretty much every Muslim I know, colleagues, friends, whatever, in the US, they feel uncomfortable or offended by radical Islam.
Does it help recruitment?
And there's a lot of magical thinking about this, as though, yes, if we suddenly started saying radical Islam, it would all go away. And of course, it would make absolutely not one scintilla of difference to the fight against extremism around the world if we use that phrase. And in fact, the very debate that we're having about it fuels their arguments about why the West is against Islam.
Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you for coming.